Hi, everybody. Okay, perfect. Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event. We welcome you to a dialogue on racial melancholia. This is the first of a series of dialogues that the Department of Comparative Literature will be hosting this year. And so we welcome you to the first one. There are a few things that I want to say in getting us started and moving into the dialogue. First of which is that I really would like to thank everyone who has helped put this together. So the Department of Comparative Literature, the Divinity School, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture have all offered generous support for this event, and we really want to thank everyone involved in that, especially Ingrid in Comparative Literature and Sarah Hammerschlag at the Divinity School. Outside of thanking everyone for putting on this event, I just want to say as well that our co-sponsorship with the study of race, politics, and culture is especially important because we are doing really important race work today and having a really important conversation on race. And so one of the things that I want to also do today is to just point everyone's attention to the More Than Diversity campaign at the University of Chicago. There have been a number of conversations and really important debates about the university's own relationship to racial bias and racial discrimination and inequities. And the folks at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture have been doing really important work in thinking about the possibility of organizing an academic unit around critical race studies, about the role of policing in the university, and also in the community around the university, and also with regards to faculty governance around diversity and inclusion. So I just want to sort of point everyone to the More Than Diversity campaign at morethandiversity.org, and you can read up more about the conversation there. And I imagine in some ways, conversations around race work and race labor may in fact emerge during the conversation today. So we'd be happy to sort of take that up as a topic of conversation. Now, let me introduce our wonderful speakers for today. So in alphabetical order, I first want to introduce Amy Hollywood, who is Elizabeth H. Monrad Professor of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School, where she teaches courses on Christian mysticism, on psychoanalysis, the study of gender and sexuality, and contemporary American poetry. She is the author of The Soul as Virgin Wife, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Marguerite Perret, Marguerite Perret and Meister Eckhart, also of Sensible Ecstasy, Mysticism, Sexual Difference, and the Demands of History, and most recently, Acute Melancholia and Other Essays. She's also currently working on a book that is co-authored with Constance Fury and Sarah Hammerschlag that is titled Devotion, 3 Inquiries in Religion, Literature, and Political Imagination. Now, our second speaker, Terence Johnson, is Associate Professor of Religion and Politics in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's the author of the forthcoming book, We Testify with Our Lives, How Religion Transformed Radical Thought from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, and co-author of Black and Jews, An Introduction to a Dialogue. He's also author of Tragic Soul Life, W.E.B. Du Bois, and The Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy, and serves as co-editor of the Religious Cultures of African and African Diaspora People book series, which is published by Duke UP. His essays have appeared in a number of edited volumes and journals, including the Journal of Religious Ethics, Journal of Africana Religions, Cross Currents, and the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics. And Johnson's interdisciplinary research is historical, critical, and constructive, and creatively weaves together African-American political thought, political liberalism, Black religion, and literature to explore the nature of justice, freedom, and moral discourse. And finally, we have with us today Joseph Winters, who is Associate Professor at Duke University in Religious Studies and African-American Studies. He holds secondary appointments in English and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and his interests lie at the intersection of African-American religious thought, Black literature, and critical theory. His research examines the ways Black literature and aesthetics develop alternative configurations of the sacred, piety, and Black spirit, And his first book, Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, was published by Duke UP in 2016. And he's currently working on a second manuscript, tentatively titled Disturbing Profanity, Hip Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred. So I want to again welcome our speakers. And just quickly, a note about format for today. All of our speakers have been asked to prepare a short sort of introductory statement in relationship to the topic of racial melancholia. They will be speaking for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes each. And then in sort of spirit of dialogue, they will engage with each other and have a conversation for us to sort of witness for about 20 or 30 minutes. And then finally, we'll move into a dialogue with the rest of the sort of attendants of this of the program, and I will be moderating Q&A between everyone who has come here. So what I ask is when we move to Q&A as well, if you could just use the sort of raise hand icon under participants, then I can keep tabs of who is asking questions. So thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Amy Hollywood.
Hi, thanks, Kris, and thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Terence and Joe. I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys speak because you may actually know what you're talking about. I'm going to start with a very melancholic, Hamlet-esque melancholy moment of saying, like, I shouldn't be talking about this, but I'm going to talk about this, but I shouldn't be talking about this. Since the 2016 election, since well before it, but with great intensity after the 2016 election, I have felt, many of us have felt injunction to speak to the contemporary US political scene. It feels more pressing than ever now that we're, however many days out from the 2020 election. Yet when it comes to US political issues, I have semi-informed opinions, I have intuitions, but I don't know anything. I'm not a political philosopher, I'm not a political scientist. I have no training that makes me particularly insightful or able to answer questions about what is going on in the contemporary scene. And yet, it feels very hard not to speak. So Joe and Terence, I say, they have training in political philosophy, have training in thinking about religion, race, and politics. I do not. I come at this as an informed citizen with some thinking about melancholia that may or may not be pertinent, and that's the question I want to raise today. So the injunction, or the felt injunction, to respond to current events really weighs on me. How do I do it? I can't. I have no business doing it. I have no expertise or particular insights to offer. And yet, at the same time, how can I not? We are all deeply implicated in what is happening in the world, but in particular in the United States right now. So what is my responsibility, and what constitutes responsibility, and what is irresponsible? Is it irresponsible for me to talk, or is it irresponsible for me not to talk? And I'm caught on that dilemma. In 2016, I spoke at the AAR. I was asked to talk about something to do with love and politics and what love has to do with it. It was a really unhinged rant coming off Toni Morrison's comments about the 2016 election in the New Yorker. I believe what I said, but I also think I was like a crazy person. I watched a tape of it afterwards. I was like, ooh, let's get that down off the interwebs. And the MLA, I think the same year, 2017, we did a panel, Kris and Eleanor Craig and I did a panel on melancholia, in which I raised the possibility that part of what we were seeing was a kind of white American melancholia, that the ideals that white Americans, many white Americans, most, all, I don't know, loved were being, were in fact killing them and us. They were killing white Americans less than they were killing non-white Americans. Non-white Americans are much more the subject of the murderous vengeance of ideals of white supremacy. And yet the ideals of the American polity that are tied to white supremacy aren't good for many of the people who are white people who in fact embrace them. And that was, I think, poignantly clear in 2016, and it's remained that way in the past 4 years, that the very ideals that people refused to let go of were in fact killing them. And I'm thinking here about opioid addiction among many, many other kinds of moments of intense suffering by Americans of all races that white Americans somehow are deflecting onto another, even as they are undergoing them themselves. At the MLA, Kalpana Shashabri-Crooks most pointedly refused this claim on my part, and I think she was right to, or she was right to raise the questions that she did. And the reason she refused it was she said that white Americans, if they are mourning something, there's no ambivalence. There's no internalized self-hatred, which is so crucial to Freud's presentation of melancholia in Mourning and Melancholia. The issue, of course, is that Freud goes on to talk about melancholia in the ego and the id and mass psychology in lots of other texts in slightly different ways. So the extent to which that self-hatred is a crucial feature of melancholy in Freud, I think, is an open question. Insofar as it is, I'm going to say things today solely about mourning and melancholia, where it is an issue. That self-hatred is that hatred of the other that gets directed against the self as the self is internalized when it is lost, as the other is internalized when it is lost. Kalpana Shashabri-Crooks is absolutely right. We see little evidence of that in the contemporary political scene. And so the question is whether melancholia is the right word to think about whatever it is going on with parts all of white America, and or whether we might attend to another aspect of Freud's essay that much less often gets written about, and that feeds right into mass psychology, and that is the part about mania. Because he's interested in the fact that there's also this oscillation between the depressive inability to act, the intense self-criticism of that oppressive inability to act, and a kind of manic, a manic overactivity and a manic embrace of self and ideals of self. And he's puzzled by the oscillation. He's puzzled about how one goes from melancholic to manic. He doesn't really give a robust explanation of it. He posits this as a set of questions. And so one of the things I want to suggest is that what we're seeing, or what we see in part in the contemporary political arena in the United States, is the mania side of the melancholic. And I think that the melancholic is there, the depressive, the inactive, the suicidal, all those things are active within white American populations. But what we're seeing around Trump is the galvanization of the manic, and that his particular talent, capacity is to generate that, to tap into and to feed and to spark that kind of mania. So the searing sweep of lies, false accusations, petulant refusals of responsibility, all pursued with a manic energy meant to deny that any loss of ideals of supremacy of value have occurred, to maintain the illusion of unambivalent love of self, of country, of whiteness, and to claim a power to act that is itself largely phantasmatic, whose conditions of life have in fact improved over the past 4 years, only that of the most extremely wealthy of white people, not that of the vast majority of white people who voted for Donald Trump, or non-white people who voted for Donald Trump. Almost no one is in a better place. So that Trump, I would say, Trump isn't melancholic. Armchair psychiatrist that I am, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not in an armchair, he's a sociopath. Okay, that, we're putting him to the side. The question is, what is he tapping into? And I think that many of his followers, and I kept thinking about what Kalpana said, and I said, no, I do think there's melancholy there. I do think there's a way in which there's a segment of white Americans, majority of white Americans, who are caught up in an oscillating movement between melancholy, inaction, depression, despair, feelings of powerlessness, and the manic activity of engaging in political actions that feel meaningful to them, even as they in fact affect no change that is ameliorative of their actual state. The key here is that Freud doesn't give us tools, I don't think fully, for understanding how that misdirection of self-critique occurs, how that gets displaced onto another. Trump is an object lesson in this. He's been able to, and started, Reagan did it. I mean, it's years of history. He's been able to take that self-criticism and direct it outward onto another. So remember the moment in Mourning and Melancholia where Freud's talking about the woman who complains about her husband, complains about herself, says, I'm a bad wife, I'm a bad, I'm a bad person, but everything that she's saying is actually a complaint about her husband. And the flip switch that we're seeing enacted in contemporary politics is that complaints about self are explicitly allowed to be and are being channeled towards that other. And not the other who is the actual cause of the discontent, not the wealthy, not the 1%, or whatever we want to say, not the systems of oppression and economic disenfranchisement that are operative, but towards marginalized others, in particular, well, people of color. And so that there's this misdirect that I think is crucial, that is part of what is going on. The ability to turn grief to grievance, and that grievance not as something that I have to be critical of myself about, but as something that is done to me, and that I can therefore go after those who I see as engendering my ideals, my belief, my sense of self. So I don't know if melancholy is the right word, although I do think the oscillation between melancholy and mania might be useful. And I'm not sure that any of this is helpful for those who are trying to navigate and think about what experiences of mourning and melancholia are for people of color, for Black people, for Latina people, for multiple Native American peoples in the United States. That's not the piece that I feel any competency to speak towards. But I do think we have to hold on to the fact that the ideal that is in many Americans' minds lost, many white Americans' minds lost, the Make America Great ideal, was never a good ideal. It was always a murderous one. And its loss is shared, its loss should be celebrated. And yet the question I think that's posed to large swaths of the white American population is, how do you celebrate a loss, the loss of an ideal that is constitutive of who you are as a political subject? It's something more complicated here than the already complicated problem of giving up privilege. Yes, that's a real question, and that's something we have to think about. But we're all cathected, we all white Americans are all cathected, and maybe not just only white Americans, this I leave open, we're all cathected to some aspect, and again, many of us are cathected to some aspect of the ideals that seem to be endangered, whether we acknowledge it or not. So there's whiteness, but then there's democracy, rights, freedom, all sorts of language that is in play. And the question that we have to ask, and that I know people much more learned than I in these subjects have been asking, is how co-constitutive with whiteness are those ideals? And how much can we separate out ideals of democratic, of democracy, of freedom, of liberty, of the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with those kinds of ideals, with the putative or the presumptive whiteness of the subject of those ideals as they were first articulated, the presumptive property owning nature of the subjects for whom, the presumptive maleness of the subjects. And so how can we disentangle those things? Can we disentangle these things? Not just conceptually, which is the work that I think a lot of political philosophy is doing, but also affectively. And that's the part where I think that psychoanalysis and some kind of understanding of the relationship between melancholia and mania, and the way they're operative in the contemporary political scene, and some recognition that melancholia and mourning is not just something that's happening to one part of the population, but it's happening in very different ways and with very different political outcomes to large swaths of the population, is something that we need to think about. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Go to Terrence.
Great. Thank you, Kris and Sarah, for the invitation. It's great to be with you all, and especially great to see my great friends and colleagues, Amy and Joseph. Just kind of want to share a few thoughts with you. Again, this is sort of out of my bandwidth, this whole psychoanalytic tradition, but I'm working on a project that's looking at politics of sort of hope and freedom, and this is sort of like a good starting point for me. So let me begin. So just a few comments in terms of the title of my reflections is Will the Babalawo or Priest Save Us? Ethics, Loss, and the Politics of Healing. Quote, are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? A lot of weight when you're well. Now just hold that thought, end quote. In Tony K. Bambara's The Salt Eaters, Velma Henry finds herself at the feet of a spiritual healer after a botched suicide attempt. Minnie, the priestess, healer, keeper of tales, wisdom giver, and conjurer of sorts, manipulates the present moment through the Black folk speech act of humming. The strange but familiar sound rattles Velma. Similar to the spirituals bellowing forth from the tiny Black church W. Du Bois stumbled upon at the turn of the 20th century, Minnie's rhythmic and repetitive humming summons the ancestors, the millions gone. Sitting face to face with, quote, her own habits of illusion, Velma finds herself gasping under the weight of broken promises, unborn dreams, and tattered relationships. The veteran Black political activist is haunted by a past that will not die or surrender itself to love or reconciliation. Quote, a grown woman won't mess around in mud puddles too long before she releases, quips the priestess. Release, sweetheart, let it go. Let the healing power flow. She wants to claim an unsubstantiated self and soul, but she can't. Torn asunder by displacement and subjugation, all Velma knows is struggle, making do with brokenness, the constant weaving together of scraps, the mundane, all too familiar struggles to find warmth from another's touch, security in another's body you can claim as yours, or the fulfillment from another's gaze, translating to the abnormal and grotesque when experienced in and through Black bodies. The healer exposes what too many of us refuse to consider: the extent to which structural white supremacy and the psychosocial dynamics of self-hatred bind us to a false sense of consciousness that is divided by Du Boisian double and triple consciousness. The past and living present, pent up inside Velma, could not find its way outside her tormented body. The endless debates in smoke-filled rooms over women's role in public protests, the energy devoted to community organizing, and the scars left behind from fractured romantic relationships had nearly destroyed her. Velma turned everywhere for solace, searching for a place to release the burden of the past and present. The narrator muses, quote, she had been listening for years to the starchy explanations from the quacks who called themselves guidance counselors, social workers, analysts, therapists, whose views had more to do with their own habits than anything rooted in the natural, the real. Folks might have faith in fools whose faith resided in a science that only filled people's lives with useless structures, senseless clutter, but she knew better. They needed some way, she knew, to be in the world, to move about, to explain things, to make up things, to go on living blind. And in time, Velma would find her way back to the roots of life. Finding her way back home, recovering an unknown past, and manipulating a frightful present reality fosters Velma's suicidal tendencies. Torn asunder by her husband's infidelity, left bewildered by Black male opposition to women's political agency, alienated from a community divided over earlier tropes of racial solidarity, Velma yearns for a new sense of belonging. Death was the route to a new beginning, she surmised, a place of belonging, where the tension between the past and present, political and psychic, and the sacred and secular did not drown her political hope, cultural longings, or religious strivings. The Salt Eaters, Bambara's first published novel, takes place in the fictional town of Claiborne, a few years following the Civil Rights era and Black Power movement. Published in 1980, the novel centers on Velma's relationship to the community healer and encounters with the ancestors. Through a series of flashbacks during her healing session, the reader stumbles upon, sometimes forcibly, the narratives, twists, and subplots buried within Velma's life. Of central concern in the novel is a community's loss of innocence and its effort to piece together a fragmented identity, one in which flesh and spirit are alien to each other at the reflective epistemic realm, but coexist in the interior soul and material soul life. Quote, part of the pleasure of the novel, John Edgar Wideman asserts in the New York Times book review, quote, derives from these dislocations and affronts. Are we really supposed to believe the conversations between people and spirits? The sudden juxtaposition of the real and the unreal, the imaginary and the actual? The novel questions and finally erodes the basis upon which such distinctions customarily depend, end quote. What is striking about Bambara's characterization of the post-Black power movement is the degree to which, quote, religion, revolutionary ethics, and Black folk spirituality are central to recovering the fragments of Velma's identity and imagining and constructing, in the broader sense, new beginnings for society left stung by war and social upheaval. Religion emerges in all kinds of complicated ways, mostly formed and fashioned by the women. For instance, they are healers, conjurers, and diviners. The women discuss tarot card readings, astrology, and magic with ease and without blinking an eye, can turn and shift the conversation to political organizing, gender discrimination, and police brutality as if they were all compatible, possibly even complementary of each other. In fact, Velma's healing session is an expression of Toni Morris's rememory, a way of transgressing epistemic boundaries through an ongoing search, both to reclaim and restore what has been stolen, denied, or deferred. During her search, Velma suspends, albeit temporarily, knowledge of the self and gives embodied existence to a set of esoteric practices. And it is in the liminal space between a knowing and unknowing where new beginnings are possible for Velma, where ethics, right, is linked, but ultimately separated from an omniscient God. Spirit is distinguished from religion, and humans pursue the divine work of becoming the salt of the earth. As Velma wrestles with the wounds from social and psychic unrest, she recovers what Yvonne Chirot reformulates as vernacular religions, hoodoo, root working, and esoteric magic practices to shed light on the entangled narratives through which humans discover and invent complex forms of what I call sacred subjectivity within non-institutionalized religion and religious practices. Indeed, through conjure and divination, the divine is revealed and human hands learn how to cultivate a sense of the sacred, aesthetic, and ethical. Sacred subjectivity exposes both the epistemic limits and the strengths of our double and triple consciousness. It too illumines new ways of knowing, reflecting back and pointing to a new humanism. To this end, religion emerges within a novel as a resource for what Charles Long calls, quote, a crawling back through one's history, a way of reimagining the past and reconstructing the present. By returning to the past, Velma suspends knowledge of the self and surrenders to a counter epistemology, that of conjure and divination, right? And it is in this liminal space where beauty sits in the presence of God and the material is transformed into the immaterial. Now, as we explore racial melancholy within the compelling work of Anne Ching and others, Bambara's understanding of the social ontology of Blackness as an extension of and reinscription of white supremacy's denial of a Black interiority or Du Boisian soul raises concerns regarding a central claim asserted by Ching's argument. Quote, that racial melancholia denotes a complex process of racial rejection and desire on the parts of whites and non-whites that expresses itself in abject and manic forms, end quote. Now, if we explore the earliest Supreme Court cases regarding citizenship and immigration laws, for instance, Alzawa versus the United States in 1922, Asians argue that they deserve citizenship because they were not racially or socially Black. In the case of the United States versus Thin in 1932, Thin argued that Indians were part of the Aryan race. In both cases, Asian immigrants seeking citizenship appealed to anti-Blackness, right, rather than to Reconstruction amendments to seek permanent and legal status as citizens. These cases remind us, according to legal historian Ariella Gross, that whiteness was created and performed legally during the late 19th and early 20th century in ways to expand and extend anti-Black laws and legal codes, while they simultaneously transformed whiteness into, quote, a material concept imbued with rights and privileges to those who conform to its definition. Now, with this backdrop in mind, I really want to sort of build this whole notion of how do we sort of look at um, sort of the Babalawo, this whole idea of priest. How do we take these sort of quote foreign categories that we often sort of leave to so-called world religions, and think about them in terms of imagining or understanding anti-Blackness, but also this whole idea of how Bambara wants us to include healing, right, as a political category, healing as a way to link to what I think she's doing in terms of linking to Frantz Fanon's call for new humanism in the post-colonial world. And maybe then vernacular religion, right, can be the starting point for rethinking humanism, right, of thinking in, outside, between and above colonialism, the East-West binary, and the lingering divide between the civilized and the barbarian. What if we retrieve then the spiritual healer, or more specifically the Babalawo, as a discursive tool for examining the ongoing ethical crisis facing Blacks, Asian, and Latinx communities, right? Who are constantly facing varying iterations of the question raised by Du Bois more than a century ago: how does it feel to be a problem? The question inevitably leads us to, according to Lewis R. Gordon, a series of existential and ethical questions that seem to dominate 20th century African and African American literature, the arts, and politics and religion. Quote, who am I? What shall I do? These questions, which cannot be easily addressed by appealing to liberal philosophy or Anglo-Christianity, shift debates on Black existence away from liberalism's discourse of rights, equality, and equal opportunity to a discussion of what I've called elsewhere the moral problem of Blackness. Quote, or what I consider to be universally agreed upon beliefs in the Black and or African as inferior, inadequate, and injured, right? Whether it is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's short story, The Miracle, Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children, or Bambara's Salt Eaters, the moral problem of Blackness seems to be the invisible presence informing and shaping the public's consumption of race, Blackness, and criminality. And just to sort of, and we're going to think about this in terms of with Amy Hollywood's earlier point, what I find very interesting, and I mentioned the Asian case not to highlight, right, like a quote problem in terms of how early immigrants use the law, but really to reinforce in terms of the degree to which I'm wondering if in this moment of sort of deep remorse, but also in this moment of deep loss for all kinds, for many different people, I'm wondering, are we sort of locked in this white-black binary, which in some ways prevents us, right, from seeing race as both a rejection and a rebuilding, but actually race as a way of reinstilling what is familiar. In other words, part of the loss that we see or we read about, say, for example, in this kind of ambiguous category of the white working class, right, is this notion that somehow their loss is without context. And this loss is, in fact, right, in the context of this imagined Black. It's also in the context of this imagined immigrant, right? And for that matter, this whole idea of Blacks and Jews. And we hear about Charlottesville, right? What they chanted was this idea that Blacks and Jews will not replace us. And so, what I've been grappling with, again, is this whole idea of to what extent then does whiteness emerge as this idea of rights and access in this category then that all groups are trying to obtain, but then how does it get, I guess, sort of muddled as we think about whiteness in the context of class, in the context of oppression. So again, I think bringing psychoanalytic theory, I think, complicates it. But I think we have to use that theory then in some ways to push against the white-black binary, which still remains. Because again, the early citizenship laws were defined, right, in this idea of the absence of the Black and not wanting then to be aligned with that group. And we see this and work and continue to work around sociology in terms of education, right? I think it's Angela Harris at Duke writes a great deal about the extent to which Caribbean Blacks and African immigrants, right, when they come to the US is very clear they do not want to be identified with American-born African Americans, right, because they do represent this kind of social ontology of criminality and the lack of the human. And so, I don't want to keep rambling, but that's into my talk, and looking forward to kind of engaging everyone and actually and learning as well. So thank you.
So first, I want to thank Kris and Sarah for the invitation. I want to thank Terrence and Amy, who I constantly learn from, and I want to thank all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. Very much appreciated. So I figured that I might start by just talking about how I'm thinking about, first of all, how I'm thinking about melancholy, and how I've been in some ways informed by my two colleagues here, Amy and Terrence, how their work has informed mine. How I'm thinking about melancholy with and I think maybe against Freud, and then maybe kind of end with just thinking about how I've been shifting how I'm been thinking about these things, where actually melancholy, I've been maybe kind of shifting away from melancholy and thinking more in terms of notions of sorrow or anguish, right? So I want to just think maybe just think a little bit about that. So Professor Hollywood, I read Sensible Ecstasy. I read her book Sensible Ecstasy back in 2004 in grad school, and I wasn't that familiar with Bataille at the time. What was fascinating to me was the way that Professor Hollywood was connecting kind of these Christian female mystics in, I guess, 13th, 14th centuries, right? But also connecting that to kind of 20th century French psychoanalytic thought, critical theory, existentialism. What I was very much interested in how she was thinking through Bataille to push back or refuse what she was calling a redemptive, right? A kind of redemptive notion of history, right? The ways in which the ruins and traumas of history get converted into something whole, something coherent, something meaningful, right? And the multiple ways in which that happens, right, within religious and secular. So even though Professor Hollywood suggests that she's not a political theorist, I mean, I thought of her work as deeply political, right? Particularly in those conversations in your book between, Bataille and Sartre, right? And maybe thinking about the limits of, right? The limits of the political, the limits of agency, the limits of what we can actually fix, right? So that was, right? So even though I wasn't necessarily thinking with Bataille as much at that time, I was thinking with Walter Benjamin, right? The German Jewish thinker, particularly his essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, or the Concept of History, depending on who's translating, right? What was fascinating to me was the way in which he was opening up the possibility of reading history differently with his reading of the New Angel, Paul Klee's New Angel, right? So a kind of vigilance or watchfulness towards the ruins of history, right? For it seems to me for Benjamin was not the opposite of, right, being open to ruptures and possibilities, right? To being open to something like what he would maybe call the Messianic, right? So for me, right, that meant that something like melancholy, something like an openness or an attunement, right, to the kind of the trauma that is history, right, the violence that is history, is not the opposite of being open to, right, newness, possibility, or reading history against the grain, right? Reading history against the dominant. So he has this moment where he says, even the dead are not safe, right? He calls it empty homogeneous time. At times he calls it progress, right? But right? So if progress for me kills the dead twice, it does this. On one hand, we know progress narratives have been ways to justify the ranking of peoples, right, and the erasure of peoples. But it also becomes a way to either forget that suffering, right, or turn that suffering into something affirmative, right? Turn that suffering into something, right? I mean, one example for me, we've been talking a lot about Charlottesville. Another example for me would be Dylan Roof's slaughter of the 8 in Charleston back in 2015, right? If you remember, right, at Emmanuel AME Church, almost 2 days, or maybe a day or two after, the killing, that slaughter, that terrorist acts, what Black people were almost compelled to do in the narrative was show, right, forgiveness, right? Look how forgiving, how humble these Black people are, and look how they represent, right, the highest ideals. So even in that moment, right, where the contradictions that the Blackness always represents with regard to the American project, almost automatically, right, those Black bodies, right, both those who have been, both those, right, were being killed, but also the remains of other Black people, they were being praised for their forgiveness, right? In a way that kind of, in some way, restores and recuperates the idea of America, right? And what was also interesting in that moment was there was a kind of implicit comparison, right, between that response and the response of people in Baltimore, Black people in Baltimore, maybe only like a month and a half after, right, Freddie Gray's death. So that would just be one example. I mean, in my book, I talk a lot about the ascendancy of Barack Obama and how notions of progress, right, triumphant narratives of progress, not new at all, but how they kind of re-articulated themselves through Obama's ascendancy and the notion of the post-racial. My indebtedness to Professor Hollywood around, right, notions of history, redemptive notions of history, and Professor Johnson's work, Tragic Soul Life. We've had conversations about this probably since like 03, 04. But there's an early essay that he has in a kind of Du Bois reader that became part of the book, where he pushes back against somebody who's influenced both of us, Cornel West's reading of Du Bois, right? So Cornel West at times reads Du Bois as at times being part of this Enlightenment project, right? That even though, right, he's thinking about, right, the souls of Black folk, the suffering of Black folk, and the contributions of the Negro, right? There's a way in which his notion of the talented 10th, his notion of civilization, always means that he has one foot in the kind of civilizationist discourses of modernity. If I remember correctly, right, what Professor Johnson says is, well, hold on, right? Like, even though you can see this in a text like Souls of Black Folk, what about his essay on, right, the essay on progress, right? When he says, what does progress mean in the face of someone like Josie, part of this community in the hill, right, the mountains of Tennessee, who dies early on because she's like overwork and labor and so forth, right? He has the kind of two different trips to this community in Tennessee, and the second time it's like, people, there's real loss. The people who were there, buildings that were there, right, are no longer there, right? But Terrence's work also takes very seriously the last chapter, on the Sorrow Song, right? The fact that every chapter begins with these musical notes in Souls of Black Folk, right? So Du Bois says, before every word, before every concept, right, the cry, right? So it's but the trace of the cry that both haunts and informs Du Bois's writing. And in Terrence's work, I mean, I see in Tragic Soul, he's saying like the Sorrow Songs, yes, it's an aesthetic musical tradition, but it also ends up, right, Du Bois incorporates it and it becomes a way, right, informs Du Bois's politics, his ethics, and even his, I think Terence wants to say, even his epistemic kind of, right, his epistemic framework as well, right? So that just as important as, let's say, a Hegel is, right, or an Emerson, is the Sorrow Song tradition. And what does that mean? And so I was, trying to think about that in my work. Du Bois is thinking with sorrow. Ralph Ellison is thinking with jazz and blues. Toni Morrison's thinking with jazz. And I could name a whole bunch of other authors too. And thinking about both these as musical and aesthetic traditions, but also as kind of, as tropes, as modes of being, as structures of feeling that in many ways shape, I would want to say, shape certain notions, or shape, or generate alternative conceptions of time and temporality, subjectivity, alterity, memory, and so forth. So that's what I'm kind of thinking about in my project. So regarding melancholy, I mean, there's been a tendency, I feel like, in the last 15 years to kind of go back and revisit Freud's Mourning and Melancholy essay in ways that I think, as Amy points out, in ways that sometimes don't take the mania part of that essay seriously. But I think in many ways, one of the things that I saw in these turns revisiting that essay, Judith Butler, David Eng, and others, is the trouble that kind of any strong distinction between mourning and melancholy, right? So if both are responses to loss, right, it almost seems like Freud is saying mourning, right, has this kind of teleological, right, like the lost object is just replaced, whereas melancholy, right, the inability to replace, and then it becomes this kind of introjection or incorporation of the loss, where there's a breakdown between the distinction between self and other, and there's where you get the self-critique and so, right. What I appreciated in authors who were revisiting that essay was to try to problematize it. I mean, because there's a way in which Freud is always, right, to some extent, complicating his own distinctions, right? Even around like healthy, unhealthy, pathological, normal, and so forth. So I was thinking about why I chose melancholy is because it had this notion of a kind of remainder, anti-teleological, but also a sense of interiority. Even though there's also the dangers, as Amy's pointed out in her book, Acute Melancholy, there's also the dangers of melancholy that I maybe didn't think enough about. So, very quickly I go from melancholy. What I'm interested in, I think more and more, right, is to think maybe instead of with melancholy is just to think about the kinds of terms and concepts that are being used by the authors that I focus the most on in my book, which, so for instance, sorrow in Du Bois, right? So I was trying to think to myself, why not just talk about sorrow, right? Because it's precisely in that last essay in Souls of Black Folk, where he's not only reflecting on the sorrow song, he says like the sorrow songs are not only are full of death and disappointment, but it's a response to what he's seeing as early 20th century, right? What he would say kind of idyllic, right? Kind of reinterpretations of slave life, right? As the harmonious slave, the happy slave, which you get a depiction of in Birth of a Nation, right? So that sense of, right. So he's emphasizing death and disappointment. At the same time, he says there breathes, right, that something like hope, right? He says through, right? So you have to go through the death and disappointment, right? In response to social death, natal alienation, right? Various forms of trauma, sexual violence, right? In the songs, right, which were always, many times were performed in secret, in hiding, right? This was constant surveillance on the plantation. It seems to me what gets passed down to Du Bois is the death and disappointment, but also the breath of hope. I didn't have access at the time. Ashton Crawley's book comes out after Black Pentecostal Breath, but there's a sense of breath, right? Something. So it's an indeterminate hope, but there's something there, right? And so that's what I was trying to think through in my project, the relationship between melancholy and hope, both in Black studies, but also in people like Benjamin and Adorno, where the melancholy it becomes for me a different way of reading history against the grain, but also a way of thinking where a certain kind of openness to the other, a certain kind of openness to the violence of the world potentially opens up different ways of maybe relating to that violence, right? And not just reproducing them. So I'll just say finally, and I'll be quiet. Recently, I've been thinking, and this is, I've been, I'm sure I don't want this to become necessarily a conversation about Afro-pessimism or Black optimism, but I've been reading a lot more of that than I did when I wrote my book, Fred Moten, Frank Wilderson, Calvin Moore, but also, I think even more deep readings of Sylvia Wynter and Saidiya Hartman and Spillers. And I've been thinking about this category of anguish, which I find in both James Baldwin and George Bataille. I don't really know what it is yet. I think I have a sense, but there's something about anguish for me, right, that acknowledges a wound, but it's not just the suffering, right? And so I've been trying to think about this notion of what I'm calling kinetic anguish, right, which brings together, right, both the wound, both the suffering, but also energy. It's not necessarily hope, right, because I don't know how much I'm interested in, but there's something about energy, about movement, a movement that can sometimes be about stillness, right? That can be about stillness, an alternative movement. So bringing that together is my way of trying to think beyond any kind of dichotomy between the optimistic and the pessimistic, which I guess would go along with what I was trying to do in the book between melancholy and hope. But I'm looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you for letting me say some things.
Thank you all. So I sort of just want to invite our speakers to continue the conversation amongst themselves a little bit and see if there's anything that they each want to respond to with regard to each other's statements. So please go ahead.
Sure. I really wanted, I have questions for both Joe and Amy, but I want to begin with Amy in terms of melancholia, in terms of using that category in terms of thinking through what we might call, say, white blues or white working class blues. In other words, I'm wondering if melancholia has these sort of three preconditions around loss, ambivalence, right, and regression of libido, is that actually something that could be very operative in the sense that if we look at sort of the legal system in terms of how whiteness has been something that's been performed, it's never been sort of historically, I guess, set in stone, but something that legally the courts have tried to make sense of it, right? To figure out what it meant in terms of racial science, in terms of social norms. If in fact there was a sense of the self, right, and a sense of a kind of socially constituted identity that wasn't always in opposition to the other, is that a pathway out? In other words, it seems as if we haven't had sort of the structural context for that kind of work, because on the one hand, we've been taught that we are racially blind, and race is really about the other, but we've never imagined whiteness as a race, right? Until over probably the last 40 years, and still people really reject it. But I'm wondering if there's another category like the self or some other prior category that would allow then, at least conceptually, to think through a kind of individual and also collective identity through traditions that then recognizes, right, how these traditions and habits are formed, right, in relationship to Blackness, but also is there a possibility to imagine them outside that kind of strict sort of white-black binary?
I mean, I think part of where I um, am articulating is as a question is that I don't really know, and I think in relationship to some of what Joe was saying, and then in response to your question, Terrence, I think that I do think it's really interesting to try to think about categories of sorrow, categories of anguish, another set of categories than those that are put forward in the putative opposition that isn't an opposition between mourning and melancholia, and I think that's crucial. But the piece, I mean, one of the reasons that mourning and melancholia ended up getting folded into each other in Freud and become almost ineradicably, impossible to distinguish, is his notion, taken up by Klein and others, that when we lose others to whom we are affected, to whom we are attached, whether they're persons or ideals or things, we take something of them into ourselves and make it, and it becomes part of who we are. It becomes constitutive of our identity in some way, and sort of all sorts of multiple and conflicting things can become constitutive of our identities, but that there's a way in which we are constituted through our losses, real or imagined. And that's the piece of the account of melancholy that I have a hard time letting go of, maybe my own melancholic disposition, and also that I don't see other language giving us an adequate account of how deeply embedded our sense of ourself in relationship to lost others is. But then you're asking a much more concrete question, Terrence, about the particularities of American political subjectivity and how it's constituted legally, and the fact that it has been constituted in terms of a black-white divide. I mean, I grew up in Maryland in the 60s and 70s. I didn't know there was anything other than black and white people until I was in graduate school. And I'm not kidding. It's a little embarrassing. It's more than a little embarrassing. And it was because Asians were presumptively white. And there weren't any where I lived, and I just it was partly the socioeconomic, but it was also the issue of where I lived, the demographics of where I lived, but it was also something about the mindset of a certain kinds of American subjectivity, and so the question I think that I want to ask you back, Terrence, is whether you see something that could exist outside of that. I mean, certainly we can imagine all sorts of things that could exist outside of that binary. But what my question is in terms of the specificity of the United States is the constitution of the subject of the law in the United States so bound up with that dichotomy as to require like really being exploded in order for something different to come into play. And I wasn't sure if that's what part of what you were saying or not.
No, it is. And part of what I've been thinking through in a new course that I've been developing or teaching is this idea of using Vincent Winbush's scripturalization to think through the Constitution, and really asking my students, to what extent, if we were to make the claim that, well, as lay people, we read the Constitution, particularly originalists, as a kind of scripture, as a kind of Bible, and to what extent is that sort of shaping, right, how we understand not only what we can glean from the Bible, but what the Bible can actually push back to us. And so I've been arguing with my class, well, what if we then imagine the Constitution in this kind of African-American biblical sort of hermeneutical tradition around the talking book, this notion of the text as being sort of very dialogical, and then taking that example in terms of, and then pushing back against originalist claims around, I don't want to defy what is present, but what if then we hermeneutically argue that no, this is actually a book of engagement, right? That doesn't presume any kind of static essentializing on either category, but it's a back and forth, right? And what's at stake is the degree to which the text can open up, not the extent to which the text is restricted. And so I've been thinking through that with Ariella Gross, and obviously, Alan Callahan and others, in terms of how do we apply these principles given, right, in terms of how a law has been used in terms of either reinforcing this very static notion of Blackness, but also then tying then whiteness to a very specific set of property, right? And how that link to property in many respects, right, has, I think, loomed large in terms of how we see busing and desegregation, because it's all tied to a sense of loss around property when one brings in this particular other, particularly the Black other, because the Black other is this kind of, connotation, right, of loss and of criminality. And and again, it's still developing, but I want to argue that I think this hermeneutical stance would be very interesting, because even in terms of even in terms of Justice Roberts' response to Obergefell, right, in terms of, well, for millennia, we have imagined a marriage in this particular concept. So who are we to come in and say this is a new definition of marriage? And my pushback is, well, if we look at, right, in terms of the idea that a slave who was told you are socially dead, right, but that heaven is your reward, but that despite that, the slave literally saw the book talking. And then I think Wimbush writes, or Senator Gates writes that, when the slave, found a way to look at the Bible, right, without and outside of the framework of his master, he was like, wow, this book isn't talking to me. So what's going on? And so I argue that, well, even when the book wasn't talking, the slave then forced the book to talk back by inserting him or herself into the text, which is why then the Exodus narrative becomes so important for thinking through early aspects of African American sort of religion and identity. Again, it's not totalistic, but it becomes one way of thinking about that kind of dialogical engagement, which is often missing when we think about American political philosophy. And then bring that back to Rawls, right? Walter says that in the conversation that, Rawls saw the civil rights movement as sort of the climax, the kind of climatic moment of what a theory of justice might look like. And part of the problem with that, then, I think, is this idea that he could not imagine the degree to which, right, all these comprehensive beliefs around anti-Blackness would flood people's liberal conceptions of what is sort of proper and reasonable. And so, again, I want to push back in terms of and expose some of the limits of this kind of social contract-ish model for thinking through our contemporary problems, but then also point to, I think there are possibilities, right, in terms of what if we see, right, this deliberative space not simply as based upon reasons we can agree upon. I think that's necessary, but can we extend that, right, to look at degrees to which, right, our kind of primary documents can become more dialogical and helping us think through these deep issues. But then we have to then somehow have a political language around loss. And, piggyback, and I want Joe to kind of talk about this in terms of, I think Afro-pessimists would have a lot to say this, but I want to push back and argue that with Bambara's notion of healing, that she is trying to set the stage that even when social death is written into the law and culture, right, by and large, people find a way, right, to push against that. And whether or not it is sort of validated outside of the veil, it doesn't matter, but people find ways of pushing back. And even in this kind of strange notion of these indigenous practices where people are believing the ancestors are showing up, right, and are talking to them, that becomes a way of crafting a new kind of episteme of the world. And again, we often take that as being folklore and kind of gibberish, but it's very informative of how people, I think, live their lives. And it speaks to, I think, the double and triple ways that people are encountering, right, social problems. So anyway, I'll stop there because I want to get Joe involved, because I think the Afro-pessimists, what you've been writing about in terms of thinking through them, I think is really important. And it is shifting the language, but I want to push back and say, well, do you agree that we have strong evidence that despite the social death that's written upon these subjects, that their voice is pushing against it? And to me, that is the extent to which we can claim as freedom. We can't claim that freedom will mean, right, it's the absence of persecution, right, or the absence of poverty, but it means that your very subjectivity is under your sovereignty and the community sovereignty. And that's what I think the best we can ask for. And maybe that's probably not overly optimistic, but yeah.
I mean, one of the things I just want to quickly say, and well, Joe, because I want to hear what Joe has to say about that also, is one of the things that you just described, Terrence, was in terms of the ways in which, at the constitutional level, at the very level of the founding of the United States polity, that whiteness is tied to property. And what that effectively does at that very moment is writes certain white people out of whiteness. And so, and yet it is always that thing towards which they aspire. And the non-white, this is complicated because, I mean, we think of it in terms of blackness, and so we think of it in terms of the black as the enslaved, but you think about Lisa Lowe's work that talks about the complexity of the relationship between indentured, Asian subjects in the Caribbean, and the ways in which that opened the space for the enfranchisement of or undoing of slavery in the Caribbean, but it depended upon the indentured servitude of another racialized other. So it does become a lot more complicated if we start looking at the details of how this happens, even if in the legal framing, both early and then in Reconstruction, it gets framed in terms of white and black. And one of the things that it leads to me is the question of, okay, what are the resources? I mean, one of the great laments, is what has happened to U.S. Class politics as articulated by people of all races. What's happened to issues of, radical economic justice, and are there ways to pull on some of those traditions that can become sites? Are they only sites of contestation, or can they? What I don't know is if I see a place that has the contours of healing, as you describe it, that are operative for the Black community, or Black communities. And so, one of the issues I think for a lot of white people is like, what are we? What are we other than our claim to superiority? And if all we are is our claim to superiority, and that needs to be disavowed, then what is the space out of which some kind of healing or imagining of a new future could come? Sorry, Joe, just talk about pessimism or anything.
No, this is great. I want to just two things to kind of back up before. There was a moment in your earlier reflections, Amy, where you said, is whiteness potentially bound up with notions of rights, democracy, freedom, right, property? And I'm always wondering, it's clearly, as Terrence is trying to get us to think about, how do we think beyond some kind of binary? How do we think about the complexities of both blackness and whiteness, right? And how they've been defined, reconstructed over time. And I'm wondering though, so there's the historical point about whiteness as a category has changed and morphed. There's also, it seems to me, I'm trying to think about the ways in which certain authors have talked about whiteness as a kind of imaginary, right? So I'm thinking particularly about Du Bois in Darkwater, Souls of White Folk, right? So he calls whiteness a religion, right? He says he said it's a belief system, right? So there's not, I don't think he's saying he's not talking about all white people there, right? It seems to me he's talking about a certain kind of what some might call a religious imaginary, belief system, economy of desire. And he says whiteness is, right, ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. So there's a temporal dimension there, right, till eternity, and a spatial one as well, right? So there is, it seems to me, right, and clearly, non-whites are committed to that belief system, right? So, but I'm just wondering, again, one could say, I can imagine someone like Adolph Reed saying, well, why racialize like that? Why don't you just talk about it as class interest or something like that? But it does seem to me, right, the language of belief, the language of desire, the language of imaginary, right, maybe allows us to think about why it is, right, that people would vote against their economic interests or something like that. We're talking about something that maybe can't be measured and can't be always measured and quantified. But that's just one thing, just to kind of put, because I'm just trying to think, when we say white, what is that about, and what are the kinds of, how is that part of a constellation or a cluster, right, of conditions, experiences, objects of desire? As far as the Afro-pessimism point, for me, I've been thinking a lot about this, recently. It seems to me, I think you're exactly right. It seems to me, right, it's either that mean, so one of the critiques, it seems to me, let's just say, I'll take Wilderson because I think other authors are doing some different kinds of things, like Sexton and Kevin Warren. It's either that Wilderson actually secretly wants the very thing that that's been refused him in some way, right? That's usually the critique of a pessimist, is that it's like a kind of disappointed right? I mean, it's like you actually still want the thing that was really never available to you, right? Or it's that like it's actually very utopian, right? Because he's calling for something like the end of the world, right? I mean, he's it seems to me, again, I don't know if everybody has a text, but I mean, I'm just thinking about certain interviews with Wilderson. Listen, he's like, listen, I think that activism is important. I think reform is important. We have to do that. We have to be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We have to do things like, we have to be invested in things like even like dash cams and like, community review. I mean, like thinking about police state violence, right? He'll say like, we need those things, but he says we also need to think, right? A level of thinking, right? Certain kinds of problems that we know can't be resolved in the meantime, that can't be resolved right now, right? So that's that sense of, I mean, that sense of social death, right? I don't think that doesn't acknowledge that that there's not always pushback. There's not always room for like resistance, refusal, and so forth, right? But it seems to me what he's saying is that, right, a world without anti-Blackness, right, would not be the world as we know it, right? And so it seems to me when I hear you saying, when you say, look, those moments of like, I don't know, like those moments of kind of, you said sovereignty, right? Or those moments of kind of pushing back, those moments of stealing away, right? And you said something that might be all we have, right? I mean, I'm wondering if, I mean, on one hand, that can seem like very optimistic. That can seem like, well, there's moments of hope, there's sights of hope, but it also seems like you're saying we're stuck, right? In some way, right? Whereas it seems to me that for pessimists can be read as saying, well, yeah, we're stuck unless we can imagine something that's radically different, right? A world that's radically different. And often when Wilderson starts talking, I mean, he almost sounds like an apophatic theologian or negative theologian, because he'll say, I can't really say anything about that, right? Right? It's so radically other, right? Maybe all I can say is what it's not, right? It wouldn't be, right? But he's always very reticent about saying what that world would look like and how we would organize. So anyway, that's what I was kind of thinking.
I mean, that's the part of Wilderson that most, to me, the fact that his early training in film studies was very much in the Lacanian universe. And in Lacan, the thing that is the others, the other possibility is always that thing that is radically unspoken. So it feels to me very much in keeping with certain fundamental theoretical frameworks that are involved in Wilderson's thinking, for there to be a realm of that which cannot be thought or named or said.
Right, exactly.
I also just want to say that the stuff on Darkwater is exactly right. I didn't articulate this well today because of time and everything else. But yeah, I think whiteness is a religion. I think it is an ideology. I think it is a belief system. And even those who and the issue is it claims access to a variety of goods and rights and privileges that even if you aren't experiencing them, you can have the hope that you will experience them. And if you aren't experiencing them, it's not the fault of other white people, it's the fault of those who are racialized as other than that white ideal. And my question really is, how do we mourn, and or is it always going to be melancholic, an ideal that is murderous and pernicious? Yeah. And that is clearly happening. And so how do we describe the fact that that's happening? And is there a way to imagine how it could happen otherwise? Sorry, Terrence, I feel like you were going to say something. I cut in.
No, you didn't. No, I'm just thinking about your great question.
I mean, I wonder if this might be a good moment for us to invite the audience as well to ask questions. So folks can either raise their hands virtually and I can call on the sort of list in order as which I see them, or you can also leave questions in the chat and I can try to also field those. So anyone who would like to join the conversation, please feel free. Yeah, Don, please go ahead.
Hi, first of all, thanks so much for being here to the three of you. This has been, probably one of best conversations I've been a part of at UChicago for sure. I have a question that is a little expansive and might take a bit of explaining, but we think about Freud in Mourning and Melancholia, kind of understanding this idea of, the cathecting of the object of loss into the ego. And then we think about the ego in the id later, when he talks about the superego is fundamentally the object cathexis of a loss. And I'm curious to Amy and to Amy especially, and also to Joe, on thinking about melancholy and anguish. It seems like, as Freud is talking about it in ego and the id, I'm a little kind of skeptical of Freud, so I might be reading this poorly here. It seems like he is sort of moving towards a universalization of melancholia. There's something melancholic about, human existence generally, in addition to something melancholic about race in Chang. And I'm wondering if that can maybe explain the identification of melancholia with whiteness. And then it also just adds to this idea I've been thinking about, where the key word that goes along with melancholia in the racial sense is complexity, but sort of defining the contours of that complexity. I've had a real difficult time with both reading Chang and reading Hope Draped in Black. And I was wondering, Professor Winters, if you had anything to say about the contours of melancholy versus the contours of anguish, and what the differences in those complexities are, or where you see sort of, a way to understand these as distinct concept outside of just, well, we don't understand exactly how it all goes on.
Amy, did you want to go first? And then, okay. Thank you, Donald, for those series of questions. So my concern, what I like about Freud's definition is that early on in that Mourning and Melancholia essay, the object doesn't always have to be tangible, right? I mean, it can be, like he says, it can be an idea, right? Like freedom, right? And so it opens up the possibility that, right, like the feeling of loss could be towards something that you've never really had access to anyway, right? But what I've been thinking about with melancholia and just the different contours that you're saying, right? There's still something, like I'm totally willing to say that I have a melancholic disposition and so forth, but it does seem to me that I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between melancholy and I guess nostalgia, right? And how I want to think that there's a difference there, right? And here I'm thinking of like Stephen Best's new book, None Like Us, right? A concern here that a kind of melancholic, that even though there might be different expressions of melancholy and how we read time, history, subjectivity, that the concern, it seems to me, is that there's some kind of fullness on the other side, right? Particularly when thinking about, right, kind of, and thinking about kind of Black experience within modernity. Stephen Best is thinking about, like, he calls it a kind of crime scene. So on the other side of the middle passage is something like Black people as a coherent Black peopleness or something like that, right? Even if it's not necessarily articulated, that's what I think. So I think what I'm kind of concerned about, not concerned about, because I don't always think nostalgia is a bad thing, right? Like, have their loves work. I mean, I think that, feeling backwards can actually do some interesting work. But the kind of when nostalgia meets mania, right? When it meets the kind of like we've lost something and this group is taking it, right, taking this away from us, right? That's a problem. And I think for me, the contours of anguish for me, I'm still trying to work it out, particularly in Baldwin, Bataille, but also slave narratives like Harriet Jacobs and others. I mean, it seems to me that I'm always trying to, seems to me, get at something like the wound and the duplicity of the wound, right? So where woundedness is both, you see, a mark and signifier of a break and a rupture, right? But also a kind of opening, right? I'm not interested in saying, like, oh, the wound is just, I mean, I don't want to turn into a euphemism either, right? I want to take seriously, but I guess I'm trying to think about, at the end of the day, what it might mean in Bataille's language to communicate through anguish, to communicate through wounds and cuts, right? Especially in a world, I mean, Terrence brought up Rawls, I know he's thinking about Habermas, where communication particularly is usually like through reasons and reasoning. And those are, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? Like, reason giving and so forth, but what might it mean to communicate, right? Interact through the cut, through the wound? I mean, In jazz, it might be, you know, trading, you know what I mean? But what might that mean? Right? I'm still trying to think what that might mean, like ethically in everyday life, also what that might mean for politics, as well as the limits, right? As well as the limits of politics. But yeah, hope that made some sense.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, that makes sense to me. And it's also, I mean, this is a mundane, well, it's not a mundane, it's a, like at this moment, slightly life or death thing. I'm thinking about the contrast between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And no matter how you feel about Joe Biden, he's a person who is capable of having his woundedness be an opening onto others, right? Whether it's performative, whether it's for real, I don't know. I don't actually care, because the fact that he wants to perform that, as opposed to performing woundedness and vulnerability as that thing to be eschewed, cast onto others, and oneself, and to insist that, you know, that you yourself, I myself, cannot be wounded, cannot be fissured, cannot be undone. So, you know, Donald Trump versus Biden on coronavirus, Donald Trump versus Biden on masking, you know, Donald Trump, you know, and his followers making fun of a picture of Joe Biden hugging and kissing his son, Hunter, as an adult. You know, all of these things point to a different way in which wound is seen as the thing that must be immediately covered over and hidden, you know, versus wounding as something that can both cause extreme pain and open one up to the suffering of others. I think it's a relatively mundane example, but we're in a place where, like, it's really salient. And the other thing I was thinking of is that yeah, to your question, Donald, yeah, Freud totally does move to a place where melancholia becomes constitutive of the self, and that we all are, you know, internalize those lost others, persons, ideals, etc. And that becomes the layering of the psyche, how we are constituted as subjects. So on the one hand, I do think melancholia is kind of a universe. I mean, you know, whether you buy this argument, Freud, I tend to think there's something right about that. And so then the question becomes, when we're talking about these different political, not political, solely social, political, you know, experiences, personal experiences of loss, how do we differentiate between the different kinds of grief and different kinds of grievance to which they give rise? Because some of them are frankly imaginary and some of them are real, and that matters.
And I wonder if I could just insert, you know, as you were talking about, Amy and Joe, this idea of mourning, and if mourning involves a kind of elimination of this sort of object that sort of binds the person, right, to a certain kind of grief. Can we bring in Fanon to help us think through what we can we to I guess help us think through whether or not can we talk about mourning without talking about death and violence? And how does Fanon push it in terms of whether it's Black Skin, White Mask or sort of the damned of the earth, that there seems to be this moment in Fanon that part of what is needed for sort of the emergence of this sort of new humanism, the sort of the death to the colonized sort of subject, right, is sort of layered, and in part it involves returning to a kind of a centralized self in terms of negritude. Then also means you return to it as a way of pushing against it and as a way of destroying it. But that in that opposition, right, one is invoking, I think it's more metaphorical. Obviously, people are going to debate this, but kind of metaphorical violence at the very act of inserting this colonized sort of subject, right? And asserting his or her sort of reason is an act of violence. And I'm wondering then, in kind of the US context, is mourning then, if it's attached to death, also very violent? And do we need then to think about mourning as sort of either the response to or precursor to death? And is there room for a category like death within sort of the psychoanalytic tradition, and as we apply it to politics? Because then that would then bring in Wilderson's concerns, right, about this concern of reinscription, but also the inevitability, right, that the only way possible is through not only a denial of anti-Blackness, but a kind of death to it, which then would involve, right, all of these sort of all of these bodies. And I think it's interesting, you know, Fanon, and again, might be a totally misreading, but he ends a couple of his books with this sort of prayer, right? And it's always a sort of litany. And I'm wondering, is that also a call to kind of rethink how we have displaced theology, or is it a kind of moment to, again, unearth these kind of primitivisms not to claim they're right or wrong, but as new categories to help us with the dilemmas we find ourselves in.
I have a question from the chat from Rachel. So Rachel is asking, after George Floyd's death this year, the national conversation on race seems to be not only putting Black trauma or Black racialized trauma into national consciousness, but the existence of white identity instead of, say, a normative or default identity into consciousness as well. So this fact that like white identity is itself produced. So I guess Rachel's asking, how do you view like this phenomenon, this recent phenomenon, I guess you would say, in relationship to the transformation or destruction of the Black-white binary? Do we see this as advancing any kind of radical change, or do we see the sort of like reappearance of this particular conflict as an illusion of progress? And I know Rachel's probably thinking about this in relationship maybe to Joe, some of your work on progress in your first book as well. So I'm curious if maybe you guys have any thoughts about that.
No, I think it's a great question. And again, my fear is that we have not incorporated this idea of mourning sort of Black pain, in part because it reminds me of the anecdote that Fanon gave in terms of when he was pinched, right, by a little white boy. It's like, oh, I didn't realize you could actually feel. There's still this sort of narrative around sort of Blackness as sort of the absence of feeling, the absence of the soul. And as I was thinking about, Rachel's great question, I was thinking about in terms of evangelical understanding of this moment, in terms of Trump as, as a sort of symbol that's being used right by God to prepare us for a new moment, and how in response to that, right, the Democrats and some African American leaders are using this moment as a way to sort of reclaim a kind of space, right, in traditional politics, right, in terms of thinking through this issue through legislation, through quote reform. And then you have, say, someone like Alicia Garza going to say, well, no, not reform isn't needed. The system's actually functioning as it was designed. So this kind of abolitionism then emerges. But what's missing, right, is again this idea of how do we deal with this loss? And I think Amy was right. Trump has been able to really tap into the idea of loss and really show how that loss is political, and it has been sort of I would say stolen. He would say stolen by the left to force you to do things you don't want, like abortion, like, pay for immigrants to come to your country and take all your benefits. And I think the so-called left, we have not been able to sort of get our hands around this idea. Well, how do we take the loss and Black death and quote politicize it, right? Because even when people still think about Black Lives Matter, it has become normalized, and you see it in so many people's yards. But it's not tied to this idea that these are dead bodies. And the only moment I saw where I felt as if it galvanized the so-called soccer mom, as well as the day workers and the people who were on the bus at 6 a.m, is when George Floyd cried out for his dead mother. At that moment, it shook countless people, right? And that was sort of the gasping moment that I think galvanized the nation, but also allowed people to hear and to see these people as thinking, feeling bodies. But my fear is that it's now lost because all the rhetoric is about let's defeat Trump. And assuming that if you defeat Trump, then we can bring in these new people, and then we're going to expand the court. But the same language around Amy Barrett, around the left-right divide, really ignores, right, these deeper, I would say, both theological and philosophical issues, right, that are driving people to wit's end and preventing us from this idea of a collective mourning and recognizing that death is happening, right? With the tumbling of statues, a certain kind of violent death is happening. And I think we are either retracting from that or we're embracing it, but that divide is not, it's not an engaged dialogical like interaction. And so I think we are simply attempting to replace and make certain kinds of shifts without actually confronting what's at the very heart, right? I think of what Chin's book is talking about in terms of loss and mourning and recovery. And I think as we think about sort of this black-white divide and these broader categories, we can actually then, I think, address more fundamentally, right, Asian Americans, Latinx, in part because their loss and mourning are very different, but yet still are derivative of this white-black binary.
I mean, I'm thinking about, I don't know where we are in time, but I am thinking about what you just said, Terrence, in the sense of how galvanizing the George Floyd moment was for many people, and the fact that, you know, they're calling for his mother, but we already had an instance of I Can't Breathe that did not spark the same kind of, and I think it was the and to me, and I don't know what to do with the fact that that's disappeared. The overlapping of the vivid descriptions of what the coronavirus was doing to people who became very ill with it. They couldn't breathe. With that moment, you know, and the you know, I've not watched, but the sheer sort of agony and also sadism of that moment of George Floyd's murder, and redoubled with the words, which were the words that are naming an inability to breathe, and then, you know, fires sweeping the West so that people couldn't breathe and couldn't go outside and couldn't run. So I mean, it feels like there's this it's this bizarre conjunction of what we could take as metaphorical, but is literally the taking away of the breath of individuals and communities and persons. You know, I don't know how we maintain the urgency of that. I don't know how, because when you can't breathe, you panic, right? And even the feeling of inability to breathe induces a panic, and it induces a kind of panic mania. And so is that the space out of which some kind of more coalesced political movement could maintain itself? I just don't know, and it raises that question about what a politics of outrage, how far it can go, because it's very hard to maintain that state of outrage. I'm doing a pretty good job of it lately, but it's, you know, but it is hard. It is hard to maintain, and I think, you know, that's the negative side of this. I mean, there's lots of negative sides of this election, but insofar as people see Biden as the kind of calm, like Uncle Joe, who's going to make everything calm down, you know, that is not helpful. And that's why I'm more interested in the wounded Joe Biden, who does look old, who does look frail, who does look, you know, wounded by his life. You know, is there a way that could be tapped into? I don't think so in terms of American Democratic, you know, electoral politics, but I do think it is about the capacity to mourn and the capacity to recognize all the dead bodies, right? I mean, and not and to think about, and to your earlier question when you said, you know, does this depend upon death and violence? I wasn't quite sure where that was going, because I'm like, yeah, and we're always going to die. So, you know, death is always going to be a factor in this. There's other forms of loss. There's the loss of, you know, your mom, because she is no longer constantly breastfeeding you, and you experience that as a death and it's not really one. But there's also when your mom dies, you know what I mean? So that's always going to be a part of the equation. The question is whether we can find public forms of mourning, and I think the language of healing is really useful there. Although I always worry that it gets too redemptive. You know, that we can allow ourselves to show our scars, and not have them as something that we're trying to cover over.
I want to be mindful of everyone's time since we're a little bit over, but if folks are willing to stay for a few more minutes, maybe what I can do is sort of combine the rest of the questions and sort of just offer them to you, and feel free to sort of answer whichever ones might resonate most. We seem to have a number of questions regarding a variety of sort of affective responses related to, say, melancholia and the topic of race. And so I'll just read these questions. So Rosemary is asking, she's curious about what the role of shame is in reinforcing this melancholic racial ambivalence. I think so. Shame is one of the sort of topics here. Lauren is asking specifically about the significance of eroticism and sadism in Melancholia and how that might relate to racial politics today. And then Agnes is asking specifically about the place of anger within these sort of psychical emotional dynamics. So both within white and non-white Melancholia and its distinctions with Mania. So we have sort of a set of questions around these sort of affective varieties of response here. I just want to pose a couple of questions to you just really quickly, and feel free to answer or not answer these. One of them is quite facile, which is there a good version of Mania? So this is maybe to Amy specifically. And I had asked that question in thinking about the sort of desire for folks to perhaps want to find in Melancholia, which is cast conventionally as something pathological and therefore bad, but want to find in Melancholia a kind of radical politics, right? So then I wonder, right, is there a way in which there's a possibility of recuperating Mania as well? So that's one of the questions that I have. And then the other one, maybe that speaks specifically to Terrence, what you were saying earlier about, and also Joe, I think in your work is about trying to think through alternative temporalities, but alternative responses to the restrictions of, say, the legal apparatus that has grounded itself upon a kind of black-white binary. And I'm curious here about the role of literature or the arts more broadly and religion and their intersection, because obviously like you three are all coming from a site or a space in which both religion and literature are really significant objects of study for you. And why do these sort of like, why do these fields give us opportunities, alternatives to maybe sort of restrictive legal apparatuses? So yeah.
I mean, I'll just say something quickly about anger and rage, because it's, hi Agnes, wherever you are, there you are, hi, because it's something I've been thinking about. I think that loss engenders rage and anger, as well as sorrow and unhappiness and sadness. And part of, I mean, not to constantly, go back to Freud, he doesn't get all this right, but one of the things that he's interested in is the fact that rage is an important part of the experience of loss, and that rage we feel towards the other for leaving us, we then, on his reading, direct internally to ourselves, because we've internalized that other to ourselves. In other places, he suggests there's other reasons for that internally directed rage. And one of the questions that I have is how do we find ways to mourn others, recognize the anger that their loss engenders, find a place for that anger that isn't the debilitating forms of melancholia that I think are also tied to shame, but that's a more I don't understand. I mean, I understand shame totally, but I don't understand shame conceptually. So one of the questions that I have, and I wrote something about this recently where I was talking about mourning and the question of how to think about and negotiate death in a realm in which there isn't a sort of sacred, conception. I'm thinking about Henry James in particular, just my own thing I'm interested in. And one of the questions that I have as I was asking that is about the ways in which to create various kinds of aesthetic objects that are sites of memorialization of a lost other, ways in which to, if you want to use this language, sublimate one's mourning and melancholia into art. But the question there is what happens to the rage, because the rage is there. And I literally ended this piece I just wrote, doesn't matter, but like what happens to the rage? Like, so my point only is to say, I don't know the answer, but it's the question that I'm asking, and it's one of the questions I'm asking that I think feeds into, or not feeds into, parallels questions that Joe, that you're asking by saying, what about thinking about anguish instead of melancholia or mourning? And part of that is because anguish seems to carry internal to it something about rage. I think melancholia does too, but in a different way. And one of the questions is, how do we direct our rage, and how do we allow our rage to be misdirected? My worry about Mania is that Mania is the site where all self-critical capacities are lost, and so one's ability to think about whether one's rage is directed to the proper object is sacrificed. So that's my worry about mania.
Oh, and then just very briefly, I didn't want to cut off Joe, just in terms of why religion and literature for thinking through sort of legal apparatus. I mean, part of it's just more strategic in terms of trying to find a way into a series of conversations, but also, thinking it through with Rorty and some other figures, when we think about, how do we gain access to, say, sort of a broad audience, but also in one of the court cases in terms of the U.S. versus Thin, in terms of race, one of the jurists wrote, well, look, I know you say that, the Indian race is part of the Aryan conception. That might actually be true, might be part of the Aryan lineage. But we're talking about, he says, common sense understanding of race. And the common man understands race as you are not white. And this whole idea of common sense as a category is really interesting. And I thought, well, how do I either push against that? Because in so many instances, we see this idea of, well, how we are measuring what is sort of precedent, or how we're measuring, right, how to read, right, legal codes, has everything to do with, on some hand, legal precedent, but also in terms of what is sort of agreed upon norms, again, language around consensus. And so I see literature and religion as both being interesting poles in which people have common sense understandings of lit and religion, which I think are overlapping, but also are distinct. And I think that to get at some of these earlier legal codes that are based on really bad racial science, I wanted to bring in sort of non-canonical resources that are accessible to a wider audience, but also as a way to kind of get us to think more freely about what are the resources that we're appealing to as we think about major decisions. I thought it was interesting when Cory Booker Judge Barrett around issues around race and what is she reading to help understand, right, her conception. It was kind of like, well, I'm not reading anything. And so the question becomes, like, on issues around, say, climate change, or even maybe, abortion, we are reading all kinds of materials to make sure we understand these two very difficult subject matters. But with race, it's again, it's almost like, well, we define it just based on, I think Higginbotham calls it, based on what we see, what we feel. It's just kind of the sign that is constant but shifting. And so I wanted to bring in sort of categories that are very unfamiliar, but to do so in ways that would push us, right? The idea of scripturalization. Well, can the scripturalization, the idea of the talking book, recast the Constitution in terms of as this kind of document that we hold on the one hand as sacred, but also as a text that we use to have these ongoing conversations with. And I think just as a conception, it pushes us beyond, I think, the originalist versus this kind of, bad versions of reconstructing the text. But that I see it as something that is constant, but is shifting. So I want to bring in new categories to kind of enliven existing debates, but also to just show how the idea of common sense readings are not simply common sense, right? They're common sense and they're tied to these sort of deep legacies that we are conscious and sometimes unconscious of our commitment to.
Yeah, I guess just in response to those comments, or something you asked, Kris. I mean, for me, particularly when the move to literature or like cinema or music, the aesthetic for me, what's so important to me for that is both, thinking about affect, right? Thinking about the affective and kind of economy, affective economies, but also thinking about, right, imagination, right? So, when I'm thinking about putting, let's say, Morrison in conversation with, let's say, a political speech, it's like, when, I mean, it's not something, it's maybe kind of obvious, but it's also a reminder that, like, the political realm, which seems more real, like, that's also the product of an imagination, right? Peoplehood is the product of imagination, right? And politics, you think about in terms of particularly like political speeches or civic celebrations, but politics is also is a way of kind of, as we've been talking about, managing and regulating affect, managing and regulating desire in certain ways for particular kinds of projects. And I think to go to Amy's point about, mania, and your question about, is there good forms of mania? Because what's interesting to me is how it's not the same thing, but, that like Amy points out, the last couple pages of that essay, which nobody really goes to, it's like, yeah, I mean, the kind of, you know, the kind of anger, self-resentment, right? That kind of, that can be redirected towards an object. It's not the same thing, but there's an analogy in the way that Du Bois talks about the sorrow song, right? When he's saying it's, you know, there's this kind of sad, melancholic note, but then there's always this transition to something like what he calls not just hope, but exultation and triumph and confidence. And so I'm wondering, when Freud, if I remember this, like Freud uses to talk about mania, not only a sense of triumph, but exultation, but also ecstasy, the ecstatic in a way, right? And I don't know if the German term is, but I'm wondering if, you know, obviously, you know, we want to think about the multiple kinds of objects that our desires are connected to, but I'm also want to think here with like Bataille, maybe there's just something about like letting those desires linger without some kind of without some kind of, you know, determinate object that might allow something, right? Because it might be the corralling towards some kind of project, right? Like, you know, there's all this, right? I mean, there's like you were saying, there's all kinds of reasons to be upset, to be disappointed, to be frustrated, to be scared. But when that gets directed towards either, you know, this group is what's taking that away from you, or some restoration of, you know, the idea of America or something like that, we know that that's murderous, as always going to be murderous, as Amy points out.
And what I keep thinking about is now that the category of enthusiasm, which is read as mania, right? But that you could read it in a different way. And also about Bataille and his fascination with fascism, but his desire for something that could elicit that kind of affective and cathexis and the energies and political drives that enthusiasm or mania does, but but in a headless state, the SFO, you know, so that it wouldn't give rise to precisely the kinds of issues that were, you know, so destructive in the fascism that he's describing at that time. So my quick no, I think, is too quick, because it's like, well, now if I start thinking about enthusiasm, or I start thinking about the ecstatic and some of the ways that Bataille talks about it, I do see the potential for more resources or more potential resources for thinking about how you sort of jolt yourself out of your depressive, melancholic stupor, you know, to put it in the crudest possible ways.
Well, with that, melancholy stupor. I mean, obviously one of the detriments of Zoom events is that we don't have the sort of like, you know, informal time afterwards to catch up or to do dinners. And so I just really appreciate everyone staying a little bit over time. But thank you once again to Amy, Joe, and Terrence for this wonderful call and conversation. Thank you. Yeah, that's all. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It was a great conversation. Thanks again, Kris.
Thanks so much, Kris.
Yeah, of course.
Terrence, thank you so much, everybody.
Last people standing. Thank you guys so much. It was great.
Yeah, I stopped recording since now we're just talking, Ingrid.
Great.